You're on the Mysterious Shadows YouTube channel. Today, I'm going to tell you some disturbing and real-life horror stories. Don't forget to subscribe before the video. Have a good time. David sat in the living room, the soft hum of the television filling the quiet night. The house was eerily silent, save for the occasional creak of old floorboards settling. He had moved into this quaint suburban home with his wife, Emma, just a few weeks ago. It was an old house, full of charm and character, with its creaky stairs and drafty windows. They had thought it was perfect until tonight. David's eyes were growing heavy as he watched the flickering screen, struggling to stay awake. Then, from the corner of his eye, he noticed something, a flicker of movement in the hallway leading to their bedroom. His heart skipped a beat, and he quickly turned his head to see what it was, but the hallway was empty. Probably just a trick of the light, he thought, shaking his head. But something about it gnawed at him, so he rubbed his eyes, trying to shake off the drowsiness. When he looked again, his blood ran cold. A man, pale and gaunt, was standing in the bedroom doorway. His clothes were tattered, stained with what looked like dried blood. David's breath caught in his throat as the man began to move, walking slowly, almost deliberately, across the room. The man's gaze was fixed on David, his eyes hollow and dark. As he reached the middle of the room, he stopped, staring straight at David. For a moment, the two were locked in a silent exchange. Then, slowly, the man raised his hand, placing a bony finger to his lips in a chilling gesture of silence. His face was pale and ghostly, smeared with blood. The back of his head was grotesquely deformed, a portion of his skull seemingly missing, exposing raw flesh beneath. David was frozen in place, unable to move or even breathe as the man turned away and walked toward the old wardrobe in the corner of the bedroom. His movements were stiff, mechanical, as if he were being pulled by invisible strings. Without a sound, he reached the wardrobe, and then, before David's eyes, he vanished, melting into the shadows and disappearing into the dark confines of the old wooden doors. For a long moment, David sat there, paralyzed with fear. His mind raced, trying to make sense of what he had just seen. Had he imagined it? Was it just a nightmare? But the reality of the situation hit him hard when Emma returned home later that night. She found David sitting in the living room, pale and shaken, his eyes wide with terror. He told her everything, every horrifying detail. They decided to leave the house immediately, packing up whatever they could carry and fleeing into the night. It wasn't until the next day that they learned the truth. The real estate agent, when pressed, reluctantly told them about the previous tenant. A man had lived there alone, a recluse with no family or friends. He had suffered from severe depression, and one night, unable to bear it any longer, he had taken his own life in the bedroom right where David had seen the apparition. The police had found him lying on the floor, a gun still clutched in his hand. The bullet had passed through his skull, leaving a small, unassuming hole in the ceiling above. The same hole David and Emma had noticed when they first moved in, but had thought little of. The house had been cleaned and repaired, but the memory of that tragic event lingered in the walls, in the floorboards, and in the shadows of the old wardrobe. David and Emma never returned to that house. They sold it as quickly as they could, leaving behind whatever possessions they couldn't bear to take with them. But the memory of that night, of that ghostly figure with his ghastly wound and chilling silence, stayed with David forever. No matter where they went, he could never shake the feeling that the man was still there, watching, waiting in the shadows, with a finger pressed to his lips, urging him to keep quiet about the horrors he had seen. During the final years of World War II, in a hidden underground facility, a group of scientists embarked on a dark and secretive experiment. The subjects, 5 political prisoners captured during the war, were promised freedom if they could survive the next 30 days. The goal was to determine how long a human being could go without sleep and to observe the effects of prolonged sleep deprivation on the human mind and body. The prisoners were placed in a sealed room, stocked with enough food and water to last a month. The air in the room was laced with a special gas, a potent stimulant designed to keep them awake. For the first 5 days, everything seemed normal. The prisoners, though tense, engaged in conversation, paced around the room, and occasionally even joked with one another. The scientists monitored their every move through hidden cameras and microphones, waiting for the signs of sleep deprivation to manifest. On the 6th day, things began to change. The prisoners grew quiet, their conversations becoming brief and sporadic. By the 7th day, they had stopped speaking to each other entirely, resorting instead to muttering incomprehensible phrases into the microphones. The scientists noted these changes. Their curiosity piqued as the experiment took its dark turn. By the 9th day, the first screams were heard. One of the prisoners, a man named Henry, began shrieking uncontrollably. He pounded on the walls, his voice growing hoarse as he screamed for hours on end. The others showed little reaction to his outburst, sitting silently in their corners or whispering into the microphones. Soon, another prisoner, Robert, joined in, his cries echoing through the cold, sterile room. The remaining 3 prisoners, David, John, and William, responded differently. They covered the small observation windows with pages torn from the few books they had been given. They continued to whisper into the microphones, their words unintelligible but filled with a palpable sense of dread. And then, on the 11th day, the screams abruptly stopped. Silence fell over the room, a silence so deep and unsettling that the scientists began to grow uneasy. They had expected madness, violence, even death, but this oppressive quiet was something they had not anticipated. For days, the silence persisted. The prisoners no longer spoke, no longer moved. They simply sat or lay on the floor, their faces hidden from the cameras by the pages they had pasted over the windows. The scientists, unable to see what was happening inside the room, decided it was time to intervene. On the 15th day, they sent a message into the room, instructing the prisoners that the experiment was over. There was no response. The scientists repeated the message, louder this time, but again, silence was the only reply. Finally, they made the decision to open the door. As the heavy steel door creaked open, the stench of blood and decay filled the air. The sight that greeted the scientists was beyond their worst nightmares. One of the prisoners, Henry, was dead, his body lying in a pool of congealed blood. His eyes were wide open, frozen in a look of unimaginable terror. The other 4 were barely recognizable as human. Their skin was torn and shredded, their bodies emaciated, their fingernails bloody from where they had clawed at their own flesh. Their eyes, sunken deep into their skulls, were wild and unfocused. The food they had been given remained almost untouched, yet their mouths and hands were stained with blood, as if they had been feeding on something else entirely. As the scientists stood frozen in shock, one of the prisoners, David, suddenly spoke. His voice was a rasping whisper, barely audible over the hum of the facility's machinery. We no longer wish to be free. The scientists, horrified by what they were seeing, tried to remove the prisoners from the room. But the men resisted violently, lashing out with what little strength they had left. In the ensuing struggle, one of the soldiers tasked with the extraction was killed, his throat torn open by John, who fought with the ferocity of a cornered animal. Another soldier lost a part of his anatomy in the chaos as the prisoners unleashed a savage, primal violence that seemed to come from a place beyond human understanding. When the dust finally settled, only 3 of the prisoners remained alive. They were taken to a nearby medical facility, where the doctors attempted to treat their wounds and return them to a state of normalcy. But the men resisted, pleading to be kept awake, begging for more of the stimulant gas that had been used in the experiment. One of the prisoners, William, was finally sedated after days of refusal. He slipped into a deep sleep from which he never awoke, his body giving out after enduring unimaginable torment. Another prisoner, Robert, underwent surgery to repair the damage he had done to himself. During the procedure, He inexplicably smiled and whispered to one of the nurses, "Keep cutting." Despite the carnage, the military commander overseeing the project ordered that the remaining 2 prisoners be returned to the room. The scientists, already pushed to the brink by what they had witnessed, were horrified by the command. One of the lead researchers, unable to bear the thought of continuing the experiment, snapped. He pulled out a weapon and shot the commander, his sanity shattered by the events that had unfolded. Before he killed the last remaining prisoner, the researcher asked a final question. "What are you?" The prisoner, his voice barely more than a breath, replied with a chilling certainty, "Have you forgotten so easily? We are you." With that, the researcher ended the nightmare, silencing the last of the damned souls created by the experiment. But the horror of what had been unleashed in that room, the darkness that had consumed those men, would haunt the minds of those involved for the rest of their lives. The experiment had revealed something far more terrifying than anyone could have anticipated: a glimpse into the abyss of the human soul, where monsters and men were one and the same.